I hope you rot in that shop, old man. That's the last text message my daughter sent me before the police showed up at my door. Not, I'm worried about you. Not, are you okay? 6 words sent at 11:47 at night after I refused to sign away everything I own so she could buy a penthouse with a man who never once shook my hand like he meant it. 41 years I spent building that shop with these 2 hands. Scars on both palms. A table saw kickback in '98 that nearly took 2 fingers. 5 winters working night shifts so she could have the coat the other girls had. And 3 days after she told a room full of strangers her father was dead. An architect, gone, working overseas. Easier to invent than to explain. She wanted my signature on a mortgage that would have buried me before the ink dried. I didn't sign. I wrote 1 word on the back of that contract in pencil, 2 inches tall, hard enough to nearly tear the page. Then I sold everything, disappeared without a forwarding address, and mailed her a cardboard box with $20 in it, the first paycheck I ever earned, and a letter that made her collapse on the floor of her own office in front of 30 coworkers. She called 911 after that. Told them her own father was suicidal. 2 officers stood in my kitchen while I poured them coffee with steady hands, because I knew exactly what she was trying to do, and it wasn't save my life. If you've got a father, a mother, anyone who gave you everything they had and asked for nothing back, stop scrolling for the next 4 minutes. This one's going to hurt. Hit subscribe now, because you're going to want to see how this ends. And drop a comment the second that text message hits you the way it hit me. I want to know I'm not the only one who felt their stomach drop reading those 6 words. If you've ever been the parent nobody had room for at the table, this story is for you tonight. One more thing before we start. This is a story about elder financial abuse, a parent being falsely reported to the police, and a family coming apart before it comes back together. If any part of that sits too close to something you're carrying right now, take care of yourself first. The story will still be here. Now let me take you back to the morning it started. The morning a courier van pulled up outside my shop, and I picked up a pencil instead of a phone. The rag stopped moving in my hand the second I saw the courier van pull up outside the shop. Something in my gut told me, before I'd even crossed the floor to open the door, that this package was going to cost me something I couldn't get back. I set down the chisel I'd been oiling. Steel gray light came through the high windows that morning, flat and cold. The kind Seattle hands you more often than sun, falling across 60 years of planers and clamps and half-finished cabinets like the whole room was holding its breath along with me. 40 years of reading wood grain teaches a man to read people the same way, which board is about to split before it splits, which smile is load-bearing, and which one is just veneer stretched thin over something rotten underneath. That morning my hands already knew something my head hadn't caught up to yet. The package was addressed to me in a printed font, not handwriting. Overnight courier, return address a PR firm downtown. My daughter's name typed under the company logo. Meredith Marsh, Director of Communications. It had been exactly 3 days since her engagement party, the one I hadn't been invited to, and for one stupid, hopeful second, standing there with sawdust still clinging to my forearms, I let myself believe this might be her way of pulling me back in. A card, an apology, something soft, something a father is supposed to receive from a daughter 3 weeks out from her wedding. It wasn't a wedding card. Inside was a mortgage guarantee agreement, thick as a small book, my name pre-printed on the signature line in 3 separate places. Not 1, 3, like someone wanted to make absolutely certain a man couldn't miss where to sign even if his hand was shaking. A sticky note was stuck to the cover page in Meredith's looping handwriting. Dad, sign this for me, please. Weston's family needs to see we have collateral for the penthouse. Love you. I read it twice before it actually landed. She wasn't asking me to co-sign a car loan or cover a caterer's deposit. She was asking me to put up my workshop and the house behind it. The only two things I owned outright in this world, after 41 years of paying them down one job at a time, as collateral for an apartment neither she nor her fiancé had any honest business affording. I did the math right there in the doorway, fast and unforgiving, the way I price a job before I ever pick up a tool. Even split two ways, even with money behind Weston. That mortgage would eat a man alive, month after month, for 30 straight years. And they wanted my life's work, my hands, my 41 years, standing between them and default in writing, with my signature as the thing holding up the whole arrangement. Here's the part that still turns my stomach every time I think about it, and I want you to sit with this number for a second the way I had to. 3 days. 3 days earlier, I hadn't been good enough to sit at her engagement dinner. I'd been kept off a guest list of maybe 80 people because I might, in her own words, feel out of place. 3 days later, I was suddenly good enough to sign my name against 6 figures of someone else's debt, no questions asked, no dinner required, no seat at any table. Not welcome at the table. Welcome on the paperwork. Good enough to lose everything for her. Not good enough to sit beside her while she raised a glass to it. I remembered the phone call from a few weeks before that, the one where she'd explained gently, carefully, why I wasn't invited to the real event. "We're doing a smaller thing first, Dad, just close family and Weston's business contacts," she'd said, her voice bright, and rushed the way it got when she'd already decided something. "It's a lot of French service, very formal. I just didn't want you to feel out of place with all that fork business. There's a bigger celebration coming, I promise. You'll be right in the middle of it." I'd said, "Of course, sweetheart. Don't worry about me." I'd almost believed it, right up until I was standing on a cold sidewalk 3 nights earlier, outside a restaurant I couldn't have afforded to eat in on a good month. Watching gold light spill across white tablecloths, I wasn't welcome to sit at. In a suit I'd bought specifically for an evening I wasn't going to be let into. I carried the contract to my workbench and set it down next to the vice. My own name, typed in that clean, confident font, waiting for a signature like it was already owed one. Like 41 years of my labor were simply a line item somebody else had already decided to spend without asking me first, the way you'd spend a stranger's money because you never had to watch him earn it, board by board, winter by winter. I picked up a carpenter's pencil, the flat kind, sharpened with a utility knife, the same way I've sharpened them since before Meredith was born, and turned the contract over to its blank back page. I wrote one word 2 inches tall, hard enough that the pencil nearly tore straight through the paper. No, I didn't call her. I didn't call Weston, and I didn't call his parents, whoever they were to me. Now beyond a few names, I'd only ever heard secondhand from a party I never got to attend. I picked up the shop phone instead and dialed a broker I hadn't spoken to in almost 15 years. "Mr. Marsh," he said, "it's been a while." "It has," I told him. "I want to sell the workshop." There was a pause on the line, the kind of pause a man makes when he's recalculating everything he thought he knew about you in real time. "This workshop? The one you swore to me you'd die in?" "That one," I said. "The building, the equipment, the lot. All of it. I want it listed today before I have time to change my mind." "Can I ask what brought this on?" I looked down at the word "no," sitting there in soft gray pencil, somehow heavier than anything printed in ink on the front page of that contract. "Family business," I said. "Just get it done, and get it done fast, because I won't have a better answer if you ask me twice." After I hung up, I stood in the shop a long time, listening to the building settle the way old buildings do, the way it had settled every single morning for 41 years while I worked in it. First as a young apprentice, then a husband, then a father alone after Helen died, when Meredith became the only reason any of it still made sense to me. I thought about the sticky note again. "Love you," 2 words used like a postage stamp. Cheap, quick, meant only to move a piece of mail along, not to mean anything at all. I folded the contract in half, slid it into a drawer I don't open often, and went back to sanding the leg of a chair I'd started weeks earlier and hadn't touched since. My hands knew exactly what to do, even when the rest of me didn't. That's the thing about a trade you've given your whole life to. It holds you up on the mornings you can't hold yourself up. I didn't know yet that this would be the last week I'd own that workshop. I didn't know a cardboard box was already waiting somewhere down the road, or that a police cruiser would be sitting in my driveway inside 2 weeks, called there by my own daughter's voice, telling strangers with badges that her father had lost his mind simply because he'd finally found his spine. All I knew that gray Tuesday morning was that somewhere between the sticky note and the pencil, something in me had finally, quietly closed, the way a door closes when it's been hung true and doesn't swing open again on its own, no matter how hard someone pounds on it later or how loud they scream on the other side of it. If you want to understand why that penciled word cost me so little to write, you have to go back further than the sticky note. You have to go back to the years the sticky note never once mentioned, the years that made the workshop worth more to me than any deed could measure. The light changes when I remember those years. Not the flat steel gray of that Tuesday morning, but something warmer, mustard yellow, the color of the desk lamp I used to work under after Meredith went to bed, the color of late afternoons in the shop when she was small enough to sit on an overturned 5-gallon bucket and watch me plane a board down to nothing, sawdust curling off the blade like ribbon spooling off a spindle. I raised her mostly alone after Helen passed. Meredith was 11. I was 41, the same number, strangely, as the years I'd end up owning that shop before I sold it in a single phone call. Grief has its own arithmetic, and mine had always come out to Meredith, no matter what else was in the column. People who've never done manual work for a living don't always understand what the hands look like after 30, 40 years of it. Mine are a record of every winter I worked through without complaint. A scar across the left palm from a table saw kickback in 1998, the year Meredith started 3rd grade and needed braces we couldn't quite afford without extra shifts. Knuckles permanently swollen on the right hand from 4 decades of gripping tools in weather too cold for a man to be gripping anything at all. Sawdust worked so deep into the creases of my skin over the years that no amount of scrubbing ever fully got it out, not even the industrial soap I bought by the gallon. I used to joke with Helen, before she died, that a man could carbon date me by the wood dust still living under my fingernails, that I'd carry this trade into the grave whether I liked it or not. I tell you all of this not for sympathy, but because it matters to what comes next. Every one of those scars had a price tag attached to it somewhere down the line, and every price tag, without exception, had Meredith's name written on it. 5 winters in particular, I remember taking on night shifts at a commercial millwork operation across town, stacked right on top of my own shop hours, just so she could have the kind of coat the other girls at her private school wore without a second thought, the kind of ski trip permission slip I could sign without flinching at the cost printed at the bottom of the page. I'd come home at 2 in the morning smelling like machine oil and cedar shavings, sleep 4 hours on a good night, and be back at my own bench by 7, so the regular customers never even knew I'd been gone at all. She never asked me to do any of it, and I want to be fair about that here. She never once demanded a coat or a trip or a private school uniform. I gave those things to her because giving them to her was the only kind of love I knew how to speak fluently, the kind you build with your hands instead of saying out loud over a dinner table. College tuition came next, 4 years of it, paid down semester by semester, and then the unpaid internship at the PR firm that eventually hired her full-time, an internship I quietly subsidized for a full year because unpaid work, it turns out, is a luxury only certain families can afford, and I decided, without ever saying so to her, that mine would be one of them, even if it meant I put off replacing a saw blade that should have been replaced 2 full years earlier. I watched her walk across a graduation stage in a cap and gown I'd paid for in installments, and I cried in a way I hadn't cried since Helen's funeral, proud in a way that genuinely had no ceiling on it. That was the last year I recognized her fully, I think, looking back now. Because everything after that point started to shift, slowly at first. The way a board warps in a damp shop, so gradually you don't notice until the day it won't sit flat anymore. Weston Calloway came into the picture the spring after her second promotion, a hedge fund associate, with a handshake that lasted exactly 2 seconds too long and a laugh that arrived a half-beat after everyone else's, like he was checking the room's reaction before committing to his own. His family had the kind of money that doesn't announce itself loudly so much as it hums, constantly low, in the background of every room they enter. A lake house outside Bellingham. A membership at a club I couldn't have gotten past the gatehouse of in my good suit. I met his mother exactly once before the engagement, at a lunch Meredith arranged with visible nerves in her voice on the phone beforehand, and I watched the woman's eyes move across my dining room the way an appraiser's eyes move across a house he's already decided not to buy. "This is a very characterful space," she said, in the specific tone people use when they mean something else entirely by the word. I told her it was full of memories. She smiled the way you smile at a child who said something quaint and said, "I imagine it must be," and moved the conversation along before I could say anything more. After that lunch, the visits started thinning out. Birthdays that used to mean a full evening together shrank down to an hour, then to a phone call, then eventually to a gift card ordered online and shipped to my door with no note attached at all. Whenever the Callaways hosted anything, some gala, some fundraiser dinner, some 4th of July gathering out at the lake house, I was somehow never quite available. Or maybe I came to understand slowly over that year, I was simply never quite asked in the first place. The worst of it came the day I drove a chair across town to her new apartment downtown, a chair I'd spent 3 full weekends on, white oak, hand-carved mortise and tenon joints I'd cut by hand instead of routing them, the kind of piece I usually charge 4 figures for when a customer commissions one from the shop. I wanted her to have something in that glass and steel apartment that had my actual hands in it, not store-bought, not delivered flat-packed from some Scandinavian catalog with an Allen wrench taped to the box. I remember carrying it up in the elevator, proud of the joinery, proud of the way the grain caught the light from the hallway windows. Weston looked at it for exactly 3 seconds. "It's got a lot of character," he said, using his mother's exact word, in his mother's exact tone. And I understood in that moment that the word character had quietly become a coded insult inside this family, a polite way of saying second-hand, unpolished, doesn't belong here among the things we chose on purpose. Meredith laughed, a small, nervous laugh I recognized instantly because I'd heard her own mother laugh, that same nervous laugh, at her mother-in-law decades earlier, at a different dinner table entirely. "It's beautiful, Dad," she said, "but our place is really more, minimalist." She had it moved into the storage closet by the following weekend. I know because I asked to see it on my next visit, and she had to go find it, apologizing the whole time, the way you apologize for misplacing an umbrella, not a piece of your father's hands, sitting in a hallway closet. I didn't say anything that day. I drove home in the gray light, the same steel gray that would come back 3 days after her engagement party, and I sat in my truck outside the workshop for a long time before I went in. I understood something that afternoon that I hadn't fully let myself understand before, no matter how many small signs had already pointed there. In the polished, perfect play my daughter was building for herself, one careful scene at a time, the carpenter father with the scarred hands and the character-filled house wasn't a supporting character anymore. He was a flaw in the set design, and flaws eventually, in plays like the one she was writing, get quietly written out before opening night. To understand the pencil, you also need the restaurant. So let me take you back those 3 days, all the way to the night of the engagement party itself, because that's where the real damage was actually done, long before any contract ever arrived by courier to my door on that gray Tuesday morning. I hadn't been invited to the party in any formal sense, not in the way that gets you a proper seat and a place card, with your name printed on it in careful calligraphy. But I'd been told in that offhand way Meredith had started telling me things over the past year or so. Which restaurant, which night, roughly which hour the toasts would happen. I think some part of her wanted me to know, even if she didn't particularly want me there in the room itself, the way you sometimes leave a light on in a house you've already quietly moved out of, more out of old habit than any real intention to return. So I did something I've never told anyone, not even Walter, my oldest friend and the closest thing to family I have left in this city, besides Meredith herself. I put on the navy suit I'd had tailored 2 months earlier, the good one, the one I'd been saving without fully admitting to myself what exactly I was saving it for, and I drove downtown, and I parked 3 blocks away because parking anywhere near a restaurant like that runs you more in an hour than I used to make in a full day at the shop back when I started out as a young apprentice. I walked the 3 blocks in dress shoes that pinched at the heel, unused to being worn more than a handful of times a year, and I stood across the street in the cold October air, in the dark, outside the warm gold light spilling out of the restaurant's tall front windows, and I watched. I want to be honest about why I did it, because I've turned the question over in my own head more times than I can count since that night. I didn't go there to spy on her, and I certainly didn't go there to make anyone feel guilty about anything afterward. I went because I couldn't stand the idea of my only daughter getting engaged somewhere in this city while I sat home alone with the television murmuring in an empty house, not knowing what she was wearing that night, not getting to see her face when the ring caught the light for the very first time in front of people who loved her. I told myself I'd just look for a minute, see her happy, and drive home satisfied with that much, the way a man teaches himself to accept a smaller portion of something because it's the only portion being offered to him anymore. Through the glass, burnt orange light spilled from the restaurant's interior sconces onto the sidewalk where I stood, throwing my shadow long and thin across the wet pavement, a silhouette nobody inside would have recognized, even if they'd bothered to look outward at all that evening. I could see her clearly from where I stood. Meredith, in a green dress I didn't recognize, laughing at something someone had said, radiant in a way that made my chest ache, with a strange, tangled mixture of pride and grief I didn't have a proper name for yet at the time. Weston stood beside her with his hand resting at the small of her back, steering her, I noticed, the exact way you steer someone carefully through a crowded room full of people who matter to your future prospects. I watched him walk her over to an older man in a charcoal gray suit, a man I didn't recognize personally, but whose entire bearing I understood immediately, the particular posture of someone accustomed to being deferred to in every room he ever enters. Weston introduced them, and even through the glass, even without hearing a single word pass between them, I could read the choreography of it plainly enough, the practiced hand gestures, the way Meredith straightened her spine slightly, performing something she had clearly rehearsed before that night, maybe in a mirror, maybe in the car on the way over. Then the man said something, gesturing loosely toward the room, the kind of open gesture that usually accompanies a question about family, about where the bride actually came from, who had raised her into the woman standing in front of him. I watched my daughter's face very closely from across that street. I watched her smile settle into something practiced, something rehearsed and smooth, and even at that distance, even through inch-thick restaurant glass, I could read her lips well enough to know exactly what she was saying. I've watched that mouth talk since she was 18 months old, sounding out her very first words at our kitchen table while Helen filmed it on an old camcorder we still have somewhere in a box. A father knows the particular shape his own daughter's mouth makes when she's telling the plain truth, and he knows it just as well, maybe better, when she isn't. My mother passed away young, she said. My father is an architectural engineer. He's on a project in Europe right now, so unfortunately, he couldn't be here with us tonight. I stood very still on that sidewalk for what felt like a long time, though it was probably only a few seconds in real time. The older man, senator, or whoever exactly he was, nodded, apparently satisfied with the answer, and the conversation moved smoothly on to some other detail. Something about the venue chosen for the actual wedding ceremony and life in that golden restaurant simply continued on, warm and untouched by anything happening on the sidewalk outside, while something in me went completely quiet in a way I didn't yet have any language for. I want to tell you I felt anger first, because anger is easier to explain to other people afterward, easier to justify inside a story like this one. But that isn't the honest truth of what happened to me that night. What I felt first was something closer to drowning, a slow, total loss of air, standing upright on a public sidewalk in a suit I'd bought specifically to be seen in that very room, 3 blocks from where my daughter was busy quietly erasing me and replacing me with a more presentable man entirely, a man with a title instead of calluses, a continent instead of a modest workshop on Fremont Avenue. I didn't storm the restaurant. I didn't call out her name or bang on the glass demanding to be let inside. What would I even have said to any of them in that moment, standing there in dress shoes that pinched? I stood there on the sidewalk, and after a while my shoulders started to shake, not with sobbing exactly, more like a held breath, finally letting go all at once. The kind of full-body shudder you feel in cold weather when your body finally admits, all at once, how cold it's actually been the entire time, without telling you a thing about it. I walked the 3 blocks back to my truck, slower than I'd walked in, each step heavier than the last. I remember very little about the drive home, except one specific, precise thought that kept circling over and over the whole way down the interstate, refusing to let go. She hasn't just hidden me from these people, she's killed me. Not literally, of course, nothing so dramatic as that. But she had taken the actual living shape of her father, the sawdust and the scars and the 4 decades of night shifts, and she had quietly murdered that man in front of a United States senator, replacing him seamlessly with a fictional architect somewhere in Europe, a man who existed nowhere at all except inside the story she needed to tell in order to be believed by the room she'd chosen to belong to now. I sat in my truck outside my own dark house for a long time that night before I could bring myself to go inside and turn on a single light. And 3 days later, a courier would arrive with a contract asking that same erased, invisible father to put his workshop up as collateral for the very penthouse those lies had helped secure in the first place. I think that's the part that finally, quietly, broke something loose in me for good. Not the lie itself, painful as it already was on its own. The audacity of what came directly after it. She had killed me off in that restaurant to make her story cleaner for the people who mattered to her now. And then, only 3 days later, she'd come looking for my signature anyway, as though the dead carpenter she'd invented could still somehow be counted on to help pay for the wedding. He'd never even been told he could attend. The listing went up on Otis Grant's site on a Thursday morning, priced fairly, ready to move fast. By Saturday, it had already been seen by enough people in the neighborhood that word reached Meredith before I ever called her myself, which tells you something about how fast gossip still travels through Fremont, even now that half the old houses on my block have been torn down and replaced with glass condo buildings full of people I don't know. She texted first, "Dad, are you selling the workshop? Call me right away." Then, about an hour later, when I hadn't answered, "Dad, this is insane. We need that contract signed by Friday. Weston's parents are asking questions about the collateral." I didn't respond to either message. I want to be honest about the fact that some small, petty part of me almost enjoyed the silence, enjoyed making her wait, the way I'd waited outside that restaurant 3 days earlier. But mostly, if I'm being truthful, I just didn't know yet what I wanted to say to her. I was still turning the whole thing over in my head, over and over, the sticky note, the senator, the invisible father supposedly living somewhere in Europe. By Sunday afternoon, the messages had turned frantic. Capital letters, multiple exclamation points, and then, without warning, they stopped altogether. I didn't think much of the silence at the time. I was out in the shop that afternoon, sanding down a set of cabinet doors for a job I'd committed to finishing before the sale went through, when I heard tires crunching on the gravel outside and looked up expecting a delivery truck, only to see a Seattle police cruiser pulling slowly into my driveway, lights off but entirely unmistakable. 2 officers got out. I set down the sander and walked to the door, wiping sawdust from my hands onto my apron, more curious than alarmed at that point. I'd lived an honest 64 years in this city and hadn't had a police cruiser sitting in my driveway since I was a reckless teenager myself, decades ago. "Mr. Marsh?" the older officer asked, checking a small notepad. "We received a wellness check request this afternoon. Someone reported some concern that you might be a danger to yourself, possibly experiencing some kind of mental health crisis. Paranoid thinking was the phrase they used on the call. Would you mind if we came in and talked with you for a few minutes?" I stood there a moment, letting that fully land. I understood immediately what had happened, and exactly who had made that call, and precisely why. Meredith and Weston hadn't been able to reach me all weekend. The contract deadline had come and gone unsigned. His parents were asking harder and harder questions, and rather than driving over and knocking on my door like a worried daughter might, they had apparently found a faster route to force their way back into my life, and, not incidentally, back into my finances. A wellness check, handled a certain way, can sometimes result in an involuntary psychiatric hold. An involuntary hold, handled a certain way, can open the door to a guardianship petition down the line. I hadn't thought my own daughter capable of walking that particular staircase step by step, but there it was, unfolding right in front of me, in my own driveway, on an otherwise quiet Sunday. "Of course," I said. "Come on in. Can I get either of you a cup of coffee? I've got a fresh pot going inside." I watched something shift in both officers' expressions almost immediately at that offer. A man genuinely in the middle of a mental health crisis rarely greets 2 strangers with badges by offering to make them coffee in a steady, unhurried voice. I led them into the kitchen, poured 3 mugs, and sat down across from them at the very same table where I'd once helped Meredith with her multiplication homework a lifetime ago. "I don't think I'm actually the one you 2 should be worried about today," I told them honestly. And then, without waiting to be asked, I pulled up the footage on my phone from the security camera above the shop door, the one I'd installed years back after a string of break-ins hit the neighborhood. I scrolled back to Friday and showed them the courier delivery arriving, the contract itself, and then I opened my messages and showed them Meredith's texts from that entire weekend. The increasingly urgent, increasingly angry demands for money and signatures, with nothing resembling actual concern for my well-being appearing anywhere in the thread from start to finish. The younger officer read through the messages carefully, scrolling further back on his own initiative, then glanced at his partner with raised eyebrows. "This really doesn't read like a wellness concern to me at all," he said quietly, more to his partner than to me. They asked a few more routine questions after that, confirmed I could state today's date, my address, my daughter's full name, all the standard baseline things, and within 20 minutes they seemed entirely satisfied and prepared to leave. Before they walked out, the older officer paused at my front door. "Off the record, Mr. Marsh," he said, "we do occasionally see exactly this kind of thing. Family members using a wellness check as a way to force access, or pressure, or sometimes control over a parent's decisions. I'll be noting in my official report that this call doesn't appear to have been made in good faith. That likely won't be pleasant for whoever placed it once it's reviewed." I thanked him and watched the cruiser back slowly out of my driveway, and then I sat back down at my kitchen table with my coffee going cold in front of me, untouched. And for the first time since that courier had arrived on Tuesday morning, I let myself get genuinely angry instead of only heartbroken. That anger sent me looking for answers. And after 4 decades in this city, I still had enough old contacts left to find them without much trouble. I called an old customer of mine, a retired commercial real estate finance man named Frank Delgado, who'd bought a set of built-in bookshelves from me years earlier, and I asked him quietly, off the books, to look into the Calloway family's actual financial standing. It didn't take him terribly long to come back with an answer. What he found confirmed something I'd already started suspecting the moment I first did that mortgage math, standing in my own doorway, with the contract still in hand. The Calloways were not, as their lake house and their country club membership so carefully suggested, sitting comfortably on old, settled money. Weston's father had quietly leveraged nearly everything the family owned into a series of increasingly aggressive real estate ventures over the previous 3 years, chasing bigger and bigger returns to cover losses from earlier bets that hadn't paid off the way he'd promised his own investors they would. The penthouse Meredith and Weston were so desperate to secure wasn't really meant to be a home, so much as it was the final piece of collateral needed to convince a fresh round of investors that the Calloway name still meant exactly what it used to mean around this city. My workshop, my 41 years of sawdust and scars, wasn't being asked to support a young couple simply starting their life together. It was being quietly asked to prop up a house of cards that was already collapsing in slow motion, dressed up in a navy blazer and a confident country club smile that no longer meant anything underneath it. I sat with that information for 2 full days before I decided what to do with it, turning it over the same way I'd turned the sticky note over days earlier. And what I finally decided was this. I wasn't going to call Meredith and carefully explain any of it to her. I wasn't going to warn her or lecture her or beg her to see clearly what I was now seeing so plainly myself. She had chosen, 3 full days before that contract ever arrived at my door, to erase me entirely in front of a room full of people who mattered to her far more than I apparently did. And then, when that erasure became inconvenient for her, she had chosen to send strangers wearing badges to my door instead of simply coming herself. I had already given that girl 30 years of absolutely everything I had to give. I decided, sitting alone in my quiet kitchen with my coffee gone cold, that I had exactly one more thing left worth giving her, a lesson she wasn't going to like one bit. The sale of the workshop closed faster than even Otis Grant expected it to. A young couple, looking to convert the space into a boutique fitness studio, made an all-cash offer. Within the first week of the listing going live, no contingencies, no drawn-out negotiation over inspection reports, and I signed the closing papers exactly 11 days after I'd written that single word on the back of Meredith's contract. I sold most of the heavy equipment along with the building itself, the planers, the industrial saws, machines that had earned their keep for 41 years, and kept only my hand tools, the ones that had been my own father's tools before they were ever mine, passed down the way some families pass down land or jewelry instead. I found a small rental house on the other side of the city, in a quiet neighborhood where nobody knew the name Marsh and nobody cared what it used to mean around this part of Seattle. I didn't leave a forwarding address anywhere Meredith could reasonably find it. I closed out the bank account she had access to as an emergency contact, a designation I'd set up years earlier, back when she was still in college, and I still trusted the world to be gentle with her. And I opened new accounts entirely under a different branch across town. I want to be honest with you about how deliberate all of this was, because I know some of you are wondering. This wasn't a broken old man falling apart and disappearing in a fog of confusion or grief. This was a man closing a door with both hands carefully, on purpose, the way a carpenter closes a door he built himself, and knows exactly how to hang true, so it never sticks or swings loose again. Before I left the old house behind for good, though, I did one more thing, something that took me most of a Saturday afternoon. I went through the boxes still sitting in what used to be Meredith's childhood bedroom, boxes she'd left behind when she first moved out for college and never quite gotten around to collecting since, year after year. Father's Day cards she'd made in elementary school, construction paper folded into crooked little books with crayon drawings of the 2 of us standing outside the workshop, stick figures holding hands beneath a lopsided sun. A small trophy from a spelling bee in 4th grade, the one where she'd looked out into the audience for me specifically right before reciting her word, and I remember standing halfway up out of my seat without even meaning to, just so she could find my face a little faster in the crowd. A stuffed rabbit with one ear worn nearly threadbare from years of being dragged everywhere by a toddler who refused, point blank, to sleep without it. I packed all of it carefully into a single cardboard box, wrapping the more fragile things in old newspaper the way I'd been taught to wrap glassware decades earlier by my own mother. And then I did something that took me the better part of an hour, sitting at my kitchen table, to work up the nerve for. I drove to the bank, withdrew exactly $20 in cash, folded the bills once, and slid them carefully into a plain white envelope. I sealed it and wrote a single line across the front in soft pencil. My first paycheck as a carpenter's apprentice. You once told me you were proud of this. I placed the envelope on top of everything else inside the box, and beneath it, tucked flat against the cardboard, I left a letter. I've thought a long time about whether to share the exact words here with you, and I've decided you deserve to hear them plainly, because I think some of you watching this tonight are standing in almost the exact spot I stood in when I wrote it. Meredith. I sold the house. Inside this box is $20, the very first wage I ever earned doing this work with my own two hands. The same work you once told a room full of strangers belonged to a man currently living in Europe instead of the man who actually raised you alone for 17 years. You told the world your father was an architectural engineer on assignment overseas. Today, that carpenter is formally stepping out of your life for good, so that you can go on living fully and comfortably inside the story you've chosen to tell everyone about yourself. Please don't try to find me. Dad, I had the box couriered directly to her office downtown, addressed plainly to the front lobby of the PR firm, timed deliberately to arrive on a Tuesday morning when I knew, from years of listening to her talk casually about her weekly schedule over the phone, that the entire floor would already be gathered together for their regular staff meeting in the open lobby area. I wasn't there to see any of it happen myself, and I want to be honest about that too, since honesty is really all I have left to offer in this. Everything I know about what happened next, I learned secondhand, mostly from Walter, my old friend, whose niece worked 2 floors down from Meredith's office and heard the whole thing before the end of that same day. The box arrived at the reception desk and was carried up during the meeting itself. Meredith opened it in front of roughly 30 of her colleagues, thinking, I imagine, that it might be some kind of early wedding gift sent over by a client. Instead, she found her own childhood staring silently back up at her, and then the envelope, and then finally the letter underneath. According to Walter's niece, she read the letter twice through in complete silence, her face going pale, almost gray itself, and then she simply sat straight down on the floor of that lobby, right there, in front of everyone she worked with, and didn't get back up again for several long minutes. I won't pretend I felt nothing at all when I first heard about it. I felt something, a complicated, tangled knot of grief and vindication I'm still not entirely at peace with even now, if I'm being fully honest with you. But I also want to tell you plainly that I didn't do any of this simply to humiliate her in front of her coworkers for the sake of it. I did it because words alone had already stopped reaching her months earlier, and I needed her to feel, physically, in her own body, in a room full of the exact people she'd spent months quietly performing for, exactly what it feels like to be erased by someone who's supposed to love you unconditionally. The rest unraveled quickly after that, faster, honestly, than I ever expected it to. Within the same week, the mortgage arrangement collapsed entirely once the bank discovered the promised collateral had been withdrawn and the underlying property already sold off to a third party. Without that collateral in place, the penthouse deal fell apart completely. And without the appearance of that deal closing successfully, several of the Callaway family's newer investors began asking pointed questions of their own, the exact same questions Frank Delgado had already quietly answered for me weeks earlier, without anyone else knowing. Weston's parents, I heard through the grapevine, turned on Meredith almost immediately once it became clear she no longer had any usable leverage left to offer their family's quietly collapsing finances. The engagement itself was called off within the month. Her position at the PR firm, already shaken by whispers about that lobby incident, became increasingly precarious once client relationships built partly on borrowed Callaway family prestige started quietly dissolving too. I didn't reach out during any of it, not once. I didn't call to check on her, and I certainly didn't call to gloat, whatever some of you watching might assume about a man who mails his own daughter a $20 bill and a goodbye letter in the same cardboard box. I simply went on living my life in that small rented house across town, learning the slow rhythms of a neighborhood where nobody knew my name yet, waiting to see, without any real certainty at all, whether the daughter I'd raised with my own two hands was still in there somewhere underneath everything she'd built so carefully on top of herself. A year passed. I want to tell you it passed slowly, the way grief is supposed to, but the truth is, it went by faster than I expected, the way years do once you finally stop waiting for a phone to ring. I settled into a quiet rhythm in my small rented house on the other side of the city. I picked up occasional custom furniture jobs through word of mouth, nothing close to the volume I used to run through the old shop on Fremont, but enough to keep my hands busy through the gray winter that followed. Twice a month I volunteered with a nonprofit that built affordable homes for low-income families out in the county, swinging a hammer alongside men half my age who took to calling me the professor because I couldn't stop correcting their joinery. It was good work, honest work, the kind that asks nothing of you except exactly what you're willing to give it that day, and give something solid back every time. What I heard about Meredith, I heard secondhand, mostly through Walter, occasionally filtered through his niece, who still worked 2 floors down from where Meredith's old office used to be. The engagement to Weston ended within a month of the lobby incident, and from what I gathered, it hadn't ended gently. The Callaway family, once the collapsing state of their finances became public knowledge in certain circles, wanted nothing further to do with a fiancé who no longer served any purpose in their carefully constructed image. Meredith lost her position at the PR firm not long after, quietly, through what management called a round of restructuring, though Walter's niece suspected the lobby incident had simply made her presence uncomfortable, regardless of performance. She moved into a small studio apartment on the south side of the city, carrying, by every account that reached me, a considerable amount of debt, much of it accumulated, trying to keep pace with a lifestyle that had never really belonged to her in the first place. I didn't feel triumphant hearing any of this, not once, and I want to be clear about that because I know it would be easy to assume otherwise about a man who mailed his own daughter $20 and a goodbye letter in a cardboard box. What I felt mostly listening to these updates over coffee with Walter was a tired, worn-down kind of sadness, the kind you feel watching weather slowly damage something you once built carefully with your own hands, knowing you could have reinforced it earlier if you'd understood what was coming. It was a Tuesday in late September, nearly 13 months after I'd sold the workshop, when she finally found me. I was out at the Habitat build site that afternoon, framing an interior wall for a single mother and her 2 boys who were scheduled to move in before Christmas. I heard a car door close somewhere behind me in the gravel lot, and didn't think much of it, until I turned around and saw her standing at the edge of it, hesitating, like she wasn't entirely sure her own feet would carry her the rest of the way across the gravel. I almost didn't recognize her at first, and that alone told me something before she'd said a word. The Meredith I'd watched through that restaurant window a year earlier had been polished in every visible direction. Hair, nails, the particular kind of expensive-looking casual clothing that costs more than it looks like it should. The woman standing at the edge of that gravel lot wore no makeup at all, her hair pulled back plainly, dressed in clothes that had clearly been worn more than once between washes. She looked tired in a way that had nothing to do with a single bad night's sleep. She looked tired, the way people look when they've been quietly carrying something heavy for a long stretch of time without ever setting it down. "Dad," she said, and her voice cracked open on that single word in a way I hadn't heard since she was a small girl waking from a nightmare. I set down the framing hammer and walked toward her at an unhurried pace. I didn't run to her, and I want to be honest about that too, because some of you watching might wonder why a father wouldn't rush toward his own daughter after a year apart. I'll tell you why. Because love, real love, the durable kind that survives hardship instead of just surviving good weather, isn't the same thing as an automatic reflex you perform on command. I had learned that lesson the hard way over the previous 13 months of quiet, careful rebuilding. She got down on her knees right there in the gravel dust, not dramatically, not performing for any kind of audience, the way she'd once performed for a senator behind a wall of restaurant glass. But simply, I think, because her legs seemed to give out beneath the full weight of whatever she'd finally driven across the city to say to me. "I'm so sorry," she said, sobbing openly now, the words coming out broken and completely unrehearsed in a way nothing about her had sounded in years. "I'm sorry for the wedding, for the contract, for the police showing up at your door, for all of it. I don't expect you to forgive me, Dad. She stopped, gathering herself. "I just wanted you to know that I finally understand. I understand what I actually did to you." I stood there for a long moment looking down at my only daughter, kneeling in the gravel dust of a job site, and I felt something rise up in my chest that I can only describe as two things happening at exactly the same time. I felt love, entirely undiminished, the very same love I'd felt watching her walk across a graduation stage all those years ago. And I felt something else too, something steadier underneath it, something that had grown quietly in me over the past year, the way new wood grows around an old wound in a living tree, sealing it over carefully without ever forgetting that the wound had happened in the first place. I knelt down in front of her, at eye level, the exact way I used to when she was small and had scraped a knee falling off her bicycle in the driveway. "I don't hate you," I told her, and I meant every word of it completely. I never did, not for one single day of this entire past year, no matter how much it might have looked that way from where you were standing. But I can't keep being a crutch for your weakness, Meredith. Forgiveness is mine to give, and I'm giving it to you freely right now, in this gravel lot, because holding on to it any longer would poison me far more than it would ever touch you. But respect is an entirely different thing. Respect is something you're going to have to earn back for yourself, slowly, on your own 2 feet, and I can't do that work for you no matter how much I love you, and I do love you very much, still. She nodded through the tears, still crying, and finally asked the question I'd known was coming from the moment I saw her standing hesitantly at the edge of that lot. "Can I come home, Dad? Can I stay with you just until I get back on my feet? I want you to understand something clearly about what I said next, because I believe it's the part of this whole story that matters most, more than the contract, more than the $20 bill, more than any other single piece of it. I said no, not out of cruelty, and not out of lingering anger either, though I won't pretend to you that there wasn't still some small measure of that mixed in somewhere underneath everything else I was feeling in that moment. I said no because I understood, finally and completely, that rescuing her one more time, wrapping her back up immediately in comfort she hadn't yet earned, would only teach her the exact same lesson that had led the both of us to that gravel lot in the first place. The lesson that consequences are simply things other people quietly absorb on your behalf while you move on unaffected. "You're welcome to visit me," I told her gently. "You're welcome to call whenever you need to, and I promise you truly that I'll answer every single time. But you're going to have to build your own way back up from here, the same way I built my own life back up after I sold the shop and started over with nothing but hand tools and a rented house. I'll be here for you. I'm not disappearing on you again, not ever. But I'm not carrying you either, not this time." She found work eventually at a small diner not far from her studio apartment, waiting tables through long shifts, a job about as far removed from a communications director's title as a person can get in this city. She started paying down her debt slowly after that, month by month, the exact same patient way I'd once paid down college tuition and orthodontist bills and ski trip permission slips, one honest paycheck carefully stretched at a time. And every Saturday afternoon after that, without fail, rain or shine, she started showing up at whatever job site I happened to be working that week, whether it was the habitat build-out in the county or a small custom piece I was building alone in my own garage. And I began teaching her, patiently, the exact same way my own father had once taught me decades earlier in a shop that no longer exists. How to sand a board carefully with the grain instead of stubbornly against it. How to read a tape measure accurately without ever rushing the number. How to sit quietly with a raw piece of wood, long enough to actually understand what it wanted to become, before forcing your own impatient idea onto it against its will. We didn't fix everything between us in a single tearful afternoon. And I want to be honest about that too, because I don't believe in the kind of tidy story where one good conversation heals 30 years of accumulated damage overnight. Some Saturdays she cried quietly while sanding a board, mourning the glossy life she'd traded everything away for a life that turned out in the end to be almost entirely hollow underneath its polish. Some Saturdays we barely spoke a single word to each other at all, just worked side by side in a comfortable, companionable silence, the exact same kind of silence her mother and I used to share working together decades earlier. But slowly, sawdust by patient sawdust, paycheck by hard-earned paycheck, something real and lasting started rebuilding itself between the two of us. Something sturdier, I honestly believe, than anything we'd ever had before. Because this time, it was built on actual earned respect instead of automatic, unquestioned obligation. If there's one single thing I want you to carry away from this story tonight, let it be this. Great parents are not the ones who quietly turn themselves into a doormat for their children to walk endlessly across without anyone ever noticing the wear underneath. Great parents are the ones brave enough to close a door, cruelly if that's genuinely what it takes, on their child's comfortable dependency, so that child can finally, truly learn what it actually feels like to stand upright on their own 2 feet. The exact same way I once learned to stand on mine, sawdust still clinging to my hands. Nobody there in that empty shop to catch me but myself alone. Thank you for listening tonight. And if this story reminded you of someone you love, or someone you've perhaps been carrying for far too long without asking anything of them in return, I hope you'll consider sharing it, because sometimes the kindest thing a parent can ever do is finally, quietly, put the hammer down.